I'm glad you mentioned that phrase, the art of the sermon, because that's what it is. It's an art form. We don't give enough credence to how important that is, and therefore many of us don't work hard enough to perfect the art of the sermon. We don't study it enough in the seminaries, and we don't give enough emphasis to it in our rabbinates. But when people ask me, how long did it take you to write that Dvar Torah, which might have been 10 or 12 minutes, let alone that Yom Kippur morning sermon that took 50 minutes. How long did it take you? I tell them, I've been a rabbi for 35 years, so I tell them, this Dvar Torah that took me 12 minutes to deliver, it took 12 hours to write and 35 years. I studied piano for 10 or 12 years when I was a child. I was considered kind of a prodigy, a child prodigy. And what that did is it gave me an appreciation of the rhythm of life, right? I still remember practicing with a metronome and I was a classical pianist. And so all of that is about emotions and rhythm and all that. And it's easily translatable into words as well. The words need to sing.
Welcome back to the J100 podcast. We are releasing this episode as Jews everywhere prepare for the high holidays, days of awe, reflection, and renewal. These are the moments when our leaders' voices matter most. And few voices are as clear and compelling as Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch. Rabbi Hirsch is senior rabbi of Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York, a former IDF tank commander, a lawyer by training, and one of American Judaism's most influential rabbis. He's also a master orator, known for sermons that stir both heart and mind. And on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when words carry special weight, his insights could not be more timely. In this conversation, Rabbi Hirsch shares his remarkable journey, his reflections on Israel on October 7th, and his thoughts on the responsibilities of rabbis at a time of crisis. Most of all, he speaks to the power of Jewish words, sermons that sing, challenge, and comfort, precisely what we seek as we enter the season of renewal. Stay with us. This is a conversation for the high holidays and for the times. Rabbi Ammiel, thank you so much for being here on the J100 podcast. It's really exciting to meet you in person. I've been following you for a long time. And I want to jump in a little bit to our conversation to begin a little bit focusing on your background. I noticed that you are the son of a rabbi, a pretty illustrious rabbi at that. I think, if I'm not mistaken, your father passed away maybe 3-4 years ago, pretty recently. And it seems like you followed in his footsteps on some level. So I'd love to hear a little bit about just maybe your upbringing, what it was like growing up, the son of a rabbi.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, David. Congratulations on ascending to the leadership of Allgemeiner. I mean, I could fill the podcast answering your first question of me. But I'll give you the shorthand version. My father established, as a young rabbi in 1962, the Reform Movement's Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C., which was the lobbying arm and the policy arm of what was then called the UAHC. It's now called the URJ. And that was on behalf of the Reform Movement. We wanted to be involved in policy matters that affected the United States and affected the Jewish community. It was somewhat controversial because of some reasons it's still controversial. Some people felt it was overly engaged in political affairs, which when you're dealing with policies, inevitably you come into contact with politics because politics is the way we determine policies. And policies have a collective morality component to it that is the business of Judaism and any religion worth its weight in salt. In any case, they established the Religious Action Center in 1962. Very, very quickly, it became the hub for the entire American Jewish community in the struggle for civil rights of the Black Americans. And in particular, my father became very friendly with Martin Luther King and the civil rights leaders. And it was the place to be in the 1960s. My father was always a Zionist. By the way, never saw a contradiction between Zionism and social justice, between what we might call today Klal Yisrael and Tikkun Olam. To the contrary, he thought that one fulfilled the other and one led to the other. And so in an environment, where he was really at the heart of the matters in Washington, D.C., he decided to move the international headquarters of the Reform Movement to Jerusalem in 1973. That's how I got there. arrived in Jerusalem 3 months before the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War. I became so Israeli that I didn't really know Hebrew that well. And of course, this was a new country, and I was 14 years old, at a very sensitive age for teenage boys. But I was so intent on assimilating and becoming one of them that if you can understand what I mean, I became more Israeli than the Israelis themselves, even. So I finished high school in Israel. I was drafted into the military and served for 3 years as a tank commander in the IDF. Then I went to study law, and I had never entered my mind that I would enter the rabbinate. Of course, my father was a rabbi. I knew that he was a rabbi, but it was not something that I had ever given any thought to until our wedding night. We were married in Jerusalem, but on the way back, we did another ceremony in London because I met my wife in law school in London, and my mother-in-law very much wanted to see her daughter married in London with a wedding gown and all that.
Fascinating. By the way, it's funny because I actually also got married in Israel. We got married in Israel. Our anniversary is this week. We got married 21 years ago in Israel. And we also had like a second wedding here in 5 towns in the United States, because also for a myriad of reasons. But before you even go up on your, I know your answer, we'll still answer the question, I guess, about thinking about being a rabbi. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
So just very, very briefly. So at that wedding, the tradition in London is that the groom gives a charge to the bride, and I worked very hard on that, and it was a good charge. People were rolling in the aisles and weeping, and so afterwards, my father's friend, who happened to be in London at the time, who was the dean of the Hebrew Union College in New York, the Reform Seminary, he comes up to me, he sticks his hand out, he says, "You don't know me. My name is Paul Steinberg. I'm the dean of the Hebrew Union College. You're wasting your time as a lawyer. You should really be a rabbi." And I had never given it consideration before.
Usually the other way. Usually it goes the other way around, right?
I'll skip the whole part about my wife's reaction and her family's reaction, but one thing led to another, and I became a rabbi.
Actually, it just reminds me also, my father-in-law, he should be well, he was the former chief rabbi of Austria, of Vienna, Austria.
Ah.
And when I met my wife, and I came to meet her family, her father, who was an illustrious rabbi, said to me, and he heard I was an aspiring young rabbi leaving the legal profession. He said to me, "What are you, crazy? You should definitely be a lawyer."
So that was the thing, in England, it's not done that British Jews leave London for another country. But the only saving grace for my mother-in-law was that at least her daughter was going to marry a New York attorney with high earning power. And then on our wedding night, she thought it was the biggest bait and switch in history.
Exactly. That's how my father-in-law felt. That I definitely get that. I want to explore for a moment. I think about many in our community talk about Aliyah, about moving to Israel, particularly, and it's interesting, post October 7th, there's been a real awakening, at least in my narrow Orthodox circles where I live in the 5 towns. But there's always hesitation in terms of, our children, where they're at in their lives, their schooling, that transition. I don't know in the early 1970s if you had any say. I'm gathering you didn't have say. And even though, of course, it sounds like you engrossed yourself in it and you became, like you said, more Israeli than the Israelis. But I am curious in terms of your fears, your thoughts. Was this something you were excited about? Was something you were afraid, unhappy about? Can you describe a little bit what was going on internally?
Well, as a 14-year-old, I wasn't eager to leave what I had known. We had spent a year in Israel when I was 10 years old. My father spent a year there on sabbatical, and all 4 of us, the 4 kids, spent time in Israel and in Israeli schools. So it wasn't a complete unknown to me. But, initially I had the same trepidations that any 14-year-old would have when they were plucked out of what they know into a new environment. But really, that lasted for a very, very short amount of time. The Yom Kippur War broke out about 3 or 4 weeks after school started, something like that, about a month after school started. And that was such a solidifying event for us because I remember this still vividly. Most of the men were off on reserve duty and they were fighting. And it was left to the students, the teenagers, to do all the work that was not being done because the men were out in the army. So the high school sent us to supermarkets and bakeries, and we were the ones who were ensuring that there was enough food in the supermarkets, there was enough bread every morning, and various other tasks like that. And that was a 3-week operation until we actually got back to school. And that really solidified my connection with my fellow Israelis, but also It really made an imprint on my personality. I only spent 7 years living full time in Israel, from 14 to 21, although I've been back, hundreds of times. I had a position in the reform movement that brought me back 3 or 4 times a year. But in terms of full time living, it was only those 7 years. But if I know you remember from the Tanakh, they were 7 years of plenty, and they filled me up totally for my lifetime, and I'm very grateful for that experience.
Before we go further, let's go back also for a moment. You mentioned you were a tank commander. I think you said for 3 years. Obviously we're in a time of war. Sadly, we've basically been in a time of war post October 7th, 2023. We are now in 2025. What was that like to be a tank commander? I don't know if you had I don't know. I don't remember exactly in those years what was going on in Israel. It's always a state of war, and I don't know if it was actual war, but I'm saying, can you share a little bit about what that experience was like and how it informs kind of how you're observing what's going on today?
First of all, I served from 1977 to 1980. They were the quietest years, I think, in all of Israeli history. And I served in Sinai. They were these ancient tanks. They were American tanks. They were called M60 Pattons. Now the Israelis themselves build much more sophisticated tanks. So they were very quiet years. I was very incentivized to go into the army. I was completely in, and I'm happy I did it, obviously. But there were people, friends of mine, who were more suited to the military than I was. I'm kind of a free spirit. Everything is regimented in the military. Some of them signed on they became officers in an extra year or 2 year. I have a brother who became an officer in the artillery units for an extra year. That wasn't me. I was happy to leave, but I was also very happy to have served. They were quiet years, but they were very important years for me. And I still see my tank partner, the person I spent 6 months with in a tank. Every time I go to Israel, we have dinner together. Whenever he comes here, he sees me. It created lifelong attachments, and the Army, the IDF, is really the great melting pot of Israeli society. You see Israelis from all walks of life. And there really is no distinction. Everybody's in the same tank together, in the same unit together, and they're all serving the same purpose. We thought at the time, it was 1978, Dot came to Israel, if you remember. It was so out of the blue, so unexpected, that the Army put us on alert, on special alert, because there was some speculation that this was a trick, this was a ruse on the part of Sadat, and they were going to come off the plane shooting, and catch Israel by surprise, which of course didn't happen. And the peace accords were finalized while I was in Sinai. And so I remember basically packing up the entire military operations that were in Sinai and moving back into Israel proper. It was a very historic time and symbolized for me. I wrote about this in the book that I published last year. It was very symbolic for me. I'll never forget, on the last journey, there was a period of time when the IDF had control of the main highway out of the Sinai Desert, and it shared during various hours of the day that road with the Egyptian army. So on the last day, after everything was packed, and this was our final trip out from Sinai into Israel, I remember we stopped in front of a sign that one IDF soldier put down there, and it was just so profound. I took a picture of it. I still have a picture of it at home. It said the following: Lo nasognu vitarnu leman shalom, which means we have not retreated. We have compromised for the sake of peace. And so, we hoped back then, this was in the 70s, that our children and our grandchildren, they wouldn't have to do this anymore. And it's very sobering that not only was that hope shattered, in some respects, the wars are worse than ever.
I'm curious, like when IDF soldiers, sadly, in the universe, depending on where you are, obviously, can be demonized, can be held up, can be held up as an oppressor. How does that make you feel, like, as somebody who I imagine still identifies on some level at your core as, you were a member of the IDF?
Of course, and we believed, and I still believe, that we lived up to the name of the military, which was the Israel Defense Forces. That's what it was about. It was about defense of the country, and it's still about the defense of the country. This war that we're enduring now throughout Israel's borders, but instigated by Hamas and now being fought in Gaza, at least for the time being. It's an existential war. The justification of this war is greater than any other war that people can conceive of. It is a war of either them or us. That's how I saw it on October 7th. That's how the majority of Israelis see it. And to this day, even though there are very significant disputes in Israel and political disagreements on ceasefire, hostages, still there is a very, very broad consensus that Israel cannot live next to Hamas long term, that they have to be destroyed. Their governing capacity has to be destroyed. Their military capacity has to be destroyed. And there will never be peace, not only for Israelis, but for Palestinians too, until that military objective is accomplished.
Is that, I mean, I know you're speaking for yourself, obviously, at the moment, but is that indicative or reflective of a viewpoint of the reform movement as a whole, like what you just articulated?
I think it's indicative, first of all, I know that it's indicative of the broad consensus of Israeli society. Again, there are very legitimate tactical differences of opinions in Israel and obviously different political persuasions and so forth. But on the issue that launched the war, that Hamas needs to be destroyed, and on that issue long term, that still Hamas governing capacity needs to be destroyed. I think there is the broadest possible consensus in Israeli society, including non-Jewish Israeli citizens, but certainly in the Jewish community. The people who are advocating for a ceasefire now are concerned about the hostages. They will not only on a humanitarian level, but on a national interest level. They believe that Israeli society needs hostages returned before anything else, and there'll be time later to get back to war with Hamas.
Right.
So it's a nuanced difference of opinion, but it's not on the main issue that Israel can't live side by side with Hamas.
Fundamentally, almost everybody agrees to the main issue. It's really just a question of how do we get there, right? What's the most effective way, or what's most pressing at the moment? What should take priority? That's what I hear.
Right. And that's a completely legitimate. I have my views. Maybe I'm sure you have your views. Your listeners have various views. But as I say, on the issue itself, there is a very broad consensus, and that's my view. Now, is that the view of? I think that's the view of the majority of the American Jewish community. Now, I include in that the reform movement. I think that's the view of most American Reform Jews. There are nuances there. There are differences of opinions in between the broad brush statement that I just made, but most American Jews, overwhelmingly, by the way, at least 80 to 85% of the American Jewish community is supportive of Israel in one way or the other, from expressing pro-Israel sentiments to defining themselves as Zionists, and considering Israel to be an important component of their own Jewish identity. Now, the other 15% or so make a lot of noise, but they're actually quite a small minority. And so I think what I just described represents the majority sentiment of most American Jews, including most American liberal Jews and most American congregants of Reform synagogues.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I don't know if you've ever heard this analogy, but it was once shared with me many years ago. I think as a rabbi, you'll appreciate it. The stucco box, the charity box, when it's full and you shake it, it doesn't make a lot of noise. But when there's only a few coins inside, it can make a whole racket, right? So that idea of like the minority making like an outsized impact in terms of the public discourse. So I always like that analogy in terms of appreciating that point.
It's a good image.
Did you ever practice law?
I practiced law for about a year and a half to 2 years before rabbinical school. When I got back, I called the dean of the Hebrew Union College and I said, okay, I'm ready to go. This was at the end of August. He said, okay, we'll send you the forms and you'll go through the forms and then there'll be interviews. And if we accept you, you'll start next year, right? A year and 3 months from when I called. I said, what are you talking about? I said, and I had already been a lawyer. I was older than the other student. He tells me, yeah, it's way too late. The school year starts in a week or two. We can't accept you for this year. So I tell him, Dean Steinberg, I want to be a rabbi now. I'm not sure that I'll want to be a rabbi a year from now. So he answers me, he says to me this, if that's your approach, then maybe you shouldn't be a rabbi. So I waited a year and I still wanted to be a rabbi a year later.
Just where did you practice that year? What were you practicing?
What happened is I studied law because it saved me 2 years from Israeli law school. So I studied law in London at the London School of Economics, where I met my future wife. And after 3 years, I went back to Israel to do various exams for people who had earned degrees abroad, in particular in England, which was recognized by the Israeli legal system. In Israel, they have what's called stage, which is kind of a clerkship. So you had to do 2 years of clerkship. And I came back. I did some foreign entrance exams, which I passed, and I applied for this stage, for this clerkship, and was accepted to the Tel Aviv District Attorney's Office for 7 months later. I came back in the summer, and that job was supposed to start in about February. So I didn't really know what to do, and of course, I'm an American citizen too, so I came to New York, and I said, I'll take the bar in New York. That'll enhance my degrees. And I'll be able to do more legal work if I'm also licensed in New York. And one thing led to another, and I started working for an Israeli firm in New York. But by that time, I had already started, sometime during that year, I had started the process of applying to rabbinical school. And I don't know if you know this, David, but marriage has a way of imposing upon you with families and mortgages and other obligations. Certain
I'm blessed with
reality.
6 children, so I get it.
So I ended up living here. Although, as I mentioned to you before, there were periods in my professional career when I spent a total of 2.5, even 3 months a year in Israel.
Okay. So you basically embark on the rabbinical path. I'm going to jump around a little bit. So you're the author of at least 2 books, could be more. But I know one was from about 20 years ago. One is much more recent, which you just referenced. I'm intrigued by the initial one, which my research reveals was a book with an Orthodox rabbi. I read a little bit about. It seems there was an opposite. It was interesting. I think there were emails going back and forth for a while in terms of conversation, dialogue. One family, one Jewish community, different perspectives. I may be formulating that wrong, but that's the gist of what I got. And then I read that there was. I guess the Orthodox rabbi, again, will remain nameless, not really relevant right now. I think you may still be friendly with him, but apparently he got some pushback and he had to kind of drop off your speaking tour and you kind of had to go on it on your own after that. I'm kind of just, I can't imagine. That must have been, I think, probably jarring, uncomfortable, to say the least. Like, what are some of your, again, this is like 20 years in the past, I think, at this point, but I'm just curious what your reflections or thoughts are on that saga, we'll call it.
So I don't think there's any need to keep his name secret because everybody knows it. It became a Jewish bestseller because, as you probably know or assume, controversy is actually good for selling books.
Controversy sells, right? There's no such why they say there's no such thing as bad PR, right?
Certainly not on this issue. We were approached by a mutual acquaintance who was a synagogue member of mine in my first job when I was a newbie, and green in judgment and wet behind the
Where was
ears.
that? Where was that first pulpit?
It was Temple Shari Tefillah in New York.
Oh, you were in New York. Okay.
Yeah, so he was a congregant and a book agent, and he also I don't really know how he knew Rabbi Reinman, Yosef Reinman, but he knew him, and he approached Rabbi Reinman first with this idea of writing this book, and then he came to me and he said, "Do you want to do it?" I said, "Yeah, I'd be happy to do it, but I can tell you that the book won't be published." At that time, I was at Artza, and I had extensive interactions with the Haredi establishment, both here but especially in Israel, and I assumed that the book wouldn't be published. Rabbi Reinman, who's a great Talmudic scholar, just a genius, very brilliant, written Sepharim that are studied in the yeshiva in Lakewood. He assured me that he had the requisite permissions and authority and authorizations. So we did the book. Until the book was published, I was pretty sure that the book wouldn't be published, but it was really interesting for me, and I wanted to do it. And very, very quickly, we became friends, and we saw each other all the time. We wrote to each other all the time. The book was a series of emails that was then lightly edited, and it came out. It turned out that I was basically right, although he was obviously right because the book was published, but he didn't actually get the requisite permits that he needed, because once the people who really counted in that world knew that the book was published, the problem was they didn't know, from his perspective, they didn't know the book was being written and would be published. Once they found out, they issued an edict that, in very colorful language, light will not coexist with darkness and falsity will not coexist with truth. So I even went to Rabbi Reinman. I said, just to make sure, do they mean me when they say darkness or you? But we had an 18-city...
He probably was wearing dark colors. So he may have been the darkness. Right?
We had an 18-city, 18-day book tour. It was the biggest thing, the biggest Jewish book of that year.
Really? Wow.
And he was very eager to go on the tour. And he even wrote in the book, I think, but he would say over and over again, I don't really have an opportunity to speak to the mainstream and majority of the American Jewish community. And if I'm able to do this through you, leveraging my interaction with you, it's a great mitzvah to do Keruv.
Right.
Which I agreed with. I agreed with that. Yeah, absolutely. Put out your best arguments for the American Jewish community. Use me. It's all L'Shem Shamayim, for the sake of heaven, right? So by the second book tour, it got so much publicity that by the second stop of the book tour in Indianapolis, we started at the 92nd Street Y. There were 700 people there and another 1,300 people who were beaming in by satellite. So there were 2,000 people in our discussion. We then went to Indianapolis towards the end of the week, and that was the last time that we were together, because by then, and he pulled out this edict and he showed me. I told him, listen, I completely understand. It doesn't surprise me. This is what I expected, but I'm going on the book tour because I committed to the book tour, and people had spent money and people were waiting for us. So we did that. But the interesting thing maybe for your listeners is we received various reports from booksellers around the country. And this book, which was called One People, Two Worlds, it was being sold at the fastest clip in zip codes of high proportion of Orthodox Jews. And the booksellers told us only one thing to bear in mind. They insisted that the book be put in a brown paper bag so that they could walk out with the book.
Like a bottle of alcohol.
But they were very interested in the arguments, and it was the arguments more than the did I persuade you that I think was the biggest contribution that we made.
What would you say was the sharpest point of contrast? I'm sure there were more than one, but if something stands out through that whole process, was maybe the sharpest point of contrast or difference, would you say?
Well, we talked about Jewish philosophy and some Jewish communal practice, and we talked a lot about Zionism and Israel. I think the biggest issue for him, or at least the Jews that they represented, that part of the Jewish community that he represented, I think there's the effort to dismantle the credibility of non-Orthodox Judaism, especially Reform Judaism, was paramount and is paramount. In other words, you're going to make these claims. I am going to show you and the readers persuasively why you're wrong. And this is what bothered the people who wanted to stop the book tour as well. They didn't want to give even a hint of credibility to the debate itself, let alone the content of the arguments. So I think that was it. If I were to zero in on the actual issues themselves, I think probably, the idea of halacha and halachic observance and the halachic method versus what exists in the non-halachic world was probably the key denominator, I think.
Do you think, this is a curiosity, do you think today, 2025, had this exercise taken place, it would have been the exact same reaction? Do you think maybe it would have been different?
Well, first of all, I would say there's no chance that this kind of book will happen again between a non-Haredi rabbi and a Haredi rabbi. Okay, it might happen with Orthodox rabbis. In fact, there was a recent really great book with Abigail Pogrobin and Dov Lisner, right? And that was great. She's a woman. He's a man. She's not Orthodox. In fact, she's a member of a Reform shul. He's the dean of, the rabbinical seminary.
That expanse of like a Haredi rabbi and a Reform rabbi, that you don't
that will never happen again in our lifetimes, as long as the forces arrayed are similar to what they were 20 years ago. So the point is, David, this is it. If you wanna get into this discussion with Reform and Haredi, this is the book. It's the only book, and there's not going to be another one for quite a while, for the indefinite future. And were it to be done today, if you were to remove all that stuff and say it would be done today, I think the reaction would be the same, which is a combination of great interest on the part of people who you wouldn't necessarily assume would be interested on the Reform side, on the non-Orthodox side. But I can't tell you how many Orthodox students and young people and rabbis read the book and were interested and followed up and asked questions. Some of them even told me, you did a halfway decent job. So I think the reaction would probably be the same. I think there's a thirst for two matters that this book represented. One, the idea that Jews of different ideologies can talk to each other. And two, Jews are still fascinated by the nature of rabbinic disputation. And
Right.
we talked about the central issues that Jews were thinking about and are still thinking about.
Right. Fascinating. I observed that you're a master orator. In fact, as we're talking, I don't know if this would be meaningful to you or not, but I was a student of Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, who was, the president of Yeshiva University and was the rabbi at the Jewish Center in Manhattan. And I hear a little bit of the way you speak in the way he spoke. That's a compliment.
I take it as a high compliment.
So I'm, as somebody who spent many years in the trade that you're in, although I'm now in obviously a different discipline, I'm curious to talk for a few minutes about the art of the sermon. I'd love to hear a little bit. How do you prepare? How do you select your topics? How maybe your speaking style has evolved over the course of a long career? I think you'd have a lot to say about this. That would be very interesting for our listeners.
I'm glad you mentioned that phrase, the art of the sermon, because that's what it is. It's an art form.
President Trump has the art of the.
Yeah. And by the way, we don't pay enough attention to that, and we don't give enough credence to how important that is. And therefore, many of us don't work hard enough to perfect the art of the sermon. We don't study it enough in the seminaries, and we don't give enough emphasis to it in our rabbinates. And we don't work hard enough to upgrade our skills to the maximum that we can achieve. Every person has different skills, but the idea is to optimize and maximize your own skills. So just to give you an example, when people ask me, how long did it take you to write that sermon? I give what I call Dvar Torahs on many weeks, which are not, full-length sermons. Sermons to me are, I often speak for 45, 50 minutes on the high holy days, partially because I want to challenge myself on whether I can keep people interested and engaged for that long. And I have a lot to say. And I figure, especially important for my congregants, it's good that they sit in shul for a little while longer. Where are they going to go? It's if they're coming to shul, they should sit in shul.
How does it work? How does it work? Like, I'm just curious, like on a regular Shabbat, your crowd is Friday night, Saturday morning. These clips I see of you, let's say on social media of your sermon, what service is that from and how long does that tend to be?
Those are from Kabbalat Shabbat services generally and High Holy Day services, both evening and morning. In Reform synagogues, the Shabbat morning is generally devoted to lots of Torah study for people who want to study Torah, and the services themselves are generally bar mitzvahs. So they're the B'nai Mitzvah kids and their families, and synagogues like ours, they're often double bar mitzvahs, so there are two families there at the same time, and that's usually the routine. That's the rhythm. But when people ask me, how long did it take you to write that Dvar Torah, which might have been 10 or 12 minutes, let alone that Yom Kippur morning sermon that took 50 minutes. How long did it take you? So, first of all, it takes me a long time. And I can go into more detail, my process of doing it. I'd be curious to hear your process too. But I tell them, I've been a rabbi for 35 years, so I tell them this Dvar Torah that took me 12 minutes to deliver, it took 12 hours to write and 35 years. 35 years and 12 hours.
Right.
But the 12 hours is significant too, because I've been doing this for 35 years and still it takes, and I have a lot of other things that I'm doing in reform shuls. The senior rabbis are often the CEOs as well. So I spend a lot of time on administration and programming and directing our staff and talking, pastoral work. So it's nonstop work. And to take out of that week 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, and to write a drash is a significant investment of time, which is the point. That's the point. It's a critical part of our rabbinates. And if we don't pay attention to it, the requisite amount of attention, then we deprive ourselves and our people from some of the glory of Judaism and Jewish understanding and Jewish teaching. And anyways, I spend, I just give you my routine. I spend Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, all days meeting people. And doing all the other stuff I need to do. Thursday is technically my day off, which is devoted entirely to studying the Parsha, reading, exposing myself to as much other information as I can. And then I write the sermon on Friday morning and come in on Friday about 2 o'clock in the afternoon for all the Shabbat activities. And that's my routine. And I think that's why I say doing this week after week after week for 35 years, that already creates a discipline and a technique that that you can build on over time and that raises your level.
I was watching a few of your clips before this podcast, and I noticed even to the minutia of your gestures, and I mean, you must have perfected some of these techniques over time. I'm saying, I just maybe this is natural. And I'm just curious, like in terms of you obviously give a lot of thought to each piece of the presentation. That's my vibe. I'm curious.
I do, and that's very perceptive because a speech, a presentation given orally, as opposed to a written presentation, an article, an essay, a book. A speech is a different art form. There is significant overlap. They're both words, and they could even, in principle, address the same basic idea or value. They're delivered in different mechanisms in different ways if you want to be effective. So you can't write a speech as you would write an article, even if you're writing on the same subject matter. So the way you choose to write a speech, a sermon, a Dvar Torah, has to conform with all of the circumstances of this oral presentation, including what happened this week, what are people thinking about, what is their mood, how receptive are they to this particular message, and then all of the techniques of rhetoric and writing for rhetoric that are necessary to maximize your effectiveness. The words that you use, the rhythm. There's a rhythm to speaking. I studied piano for 10 or 12 years when I was a child. I was considered kind of a prodigy, a child prodigy, until I was drafted in the IDF, and that's when it stopped. But I'm very happy I did that as well. I don't regret any of that. And what that did is it gave me an appreciation of the rhythm of life, right? I still remember practicing with a metronome and, I was a classical pianist, and so all of that is about emotions and rhythm and all that. And it's easily translatable into words as well. The words need to sing, and the presentation needs to coalesce and conform with the words. And all of that needs to be factored in to giving a good speech as opposed to writing an article in a Jewish journal.
Fascinating. It's like a concert on some level. I hear you describing. Who are some of your favorite speakers? They don't have to be rabbis. I'm just curious, who in the world do you admire in terms of people that you think they could be living or no longer with us, but who do you think are really great orators?
That's a really good question. My father was a great orator. A lot of this, was just kind of seeped into me. And if you're not exposed to that as a child, and you just went through whatever you went through in life, and you're the first rabbi in the family, it's harder to actually pick up because you get this stuff through just daily living, osmosis, really. He played a very big role in my life. And I don't want to sound immodest in this respect. So to the contrary, but I spent early in my career and to this day, tens and tens of hours listening to the speeches of Martin Luther King, who was a great preacher of the gospel, in addition to the civil rights speeches that he gave. I'll just tell you very briefly a brief story. We had a CCAR conference. That's a Reform Rabbinical Conference in Atlanta many years ago. And I went, and, rabbinical conferences, some of the sessions are exciting, some not so exciting. So here I was in Atlanta, and I decided to skip out from a few sessions and go to the Martin Luther King Center. I think it was on Peachtree or something like that. And they had built the new Ebenezer Baptist Church right across the street from the old Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is now basically a museum. But that was the original Ebenezer Baptist Church that Martin Luther King and his father co-led for the last years of King's life, Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. And so what they have there when you walk in is you can go straight into the sanctuary, the old sanctuary. And, it was a Southern Baptist poor community, and so it wasn't elaborate. It wasn't a grand sanctuary. That's what exists now in the new Ebenezer Baptist Church. This was just, wooden pews, and you could almost feel the sweat, that must have emanated from there. And I was alone in that small little chapel. It wasn't even a sanctuary. It was kind of a chapel, but that was where they prayed. And what they did is they played on loop from the ceiling, from the system the sound system, they played on loop Martin Luther King's speeches. And I was like mesmerized. I was alone there. And it was almost like the king and I alone. And I'm listening to these speeches pouring down from the heavens. And some of them are quoting Jewish texts, of course. And it was a really spiritual moment for me. So, and not that I compare myself to Martin Luther King, but I study the discipline and the performance of what might have been the greatest orator, certainly of the 20th century in America, and possibly of all American history.
Fascinating. No, I hear that. I hear that loud and clear. I'm curious, and I don't know. I'm being full disclosure. I don't know so many Reform rabbis yet. Are you a typical Reform rabbi? Are you not? Give me a vibe. Like, where do you kind of see yourself within that framework?
Well, typical is kind of I take
Maybe the word is
right.
representative. I don't know how to formulate it. It's like, it seems to be like the fact that like many people, let's say, were watching your clips post October 7th and found it like almost like surprising, the things you were saying, seems to clue me in that maybe it's not, maybe a little atypical in certain ways,
Yeah.
in terms of Zionism, in terms of, and you alluded to this at the very beginning, in terms of they're not, from your father, not being a clash between liberalism and Zionism. But I mean, maybe you'll share a little bit of your thoughts.
Yeah, I suppose, depending on who you ask, you might get some responses that I represent only a certain part of the reform movement and not a typical or, broad-based. I think that's wrong. First of all, as I mentioned to you, my father was part of the reform movement and a very important Reform Jewish leader for 70 years. So if you count the years, the number of years that he and later I have spent in Reform leadership, it's over a century. So what could be more typical? What could be more representative than that? With respect to the views, in particular, some of the views on Zionism and Israel, I'm typical when it comes to Reform Jewish practice, general ideas about some of the main issues of the day, God and Torah and Israel. When it comes to Zionism and the state of Israel and post-October 7th, I must tell you, David, I believe, and there is empirical data to support this, that I'm typical. That is, I am representative of the broad feelings and ideas of American Reform Jews, members of Reform synagogues in North America. Does it seem like I'm unique? Think it's because, I quoted to you before that overwhelmingly American Jews are supportive of Israel, but the younger you go, the less that's true. So that by the time you hit 18 to 24-year-olds, according to the recent survey that I read, close to 50% of American Jews define themselves as either non-Zionist, anti-Zionist, or so hostile to Israel that in effect it's the same thing. So I think there's a reticence on the part of Reform rabbis to create some kind of generational upheaval and in their own shuls, because there are always people. Israel is is a very controversial topic on any day of the year. I think there's a reticence to split the congregation or to cause unnecessary rupture or disagreement.
So you're not afraid of that?
No, to the contrary. First of all, as I said before, I think kol machloket shehi l'shem shamayim sofa liyitkayem. Any controversy that's for the sake of heaven is Jewish. It's destined to endure. And these controversies are for sure for the sake of heaven. But beyond that, the reason that people resonate to my message is because I represent the broad-based perspective of most American Jews. Whether they can articulate it in the way that I articulate it or not, I can't tell you how many times people have come up to me and said, I couldn't articulate it myself and I couldn't figure it out myself, but listening to you, thank you so much for connecting the dots, because this is what I believe. And so I don't feel that I represent the majority viewpoint, and that is one reason why people resonate so strongly. There are people who disagree, and there are people in our movement, and a growing number apparently, who are hostile to Israel. But by every measure, they are a relatively small minority still, although something to be very worried about, because, as I said before, the younger you go, the larger those numbers are. Furthermore, I would just tell you as a rabbi, I think everything changed post-October 7th. Okay, what was is no longer, and will not be. And if you're a Jewish communal leader in the rabbinate or in some other entity, and October 7th hasn't
didn't shake your entire agenda and caused you to do significant self-reflection, not only on the past, but on where we're going in the future, chances are you're not meeting the historical demands of the times, and you're not meeting your Jewish responsibilities as a Jewish leader. So it's more important than ever now, in particular when you have such a noisy opposition to Israel, Zionism, which bleeds into opposition to Judaism itself, really. And some of that comes inside the Jewish community. It's a high responsibility for Jewish leaders, especially rabbis, to counter that. Now, my door is always open. I don't cancel any Jew. I wouldn't give a platform to anti-Zionists, a public platform. But of course, my door is always open. And I've had people who have heard some of my speeches and heard me say something like this, and people I didn't know who emailed me and said, "You said that you would open your door to me. I'll be in New York and such time." I say, "Yeah, sure, come on in." And I've met these people. And so I don't cancel any Jew. And I'm not even, you know what, if there's a Jewish community that congregates, that convenes, that comes together around the issue of hostility to Israel, anti-Zionism, whatever it is, and they can find a rabbi to lead them, bless them. I mean, this is America, okay? But in this environment, I believe it's important, especially from us, from inside the tent, to be very clear. Not that we are forever closing the door to you, but what these ideas that we're not going to coddle you just because you're young. These ideas are they contravene the essence of Judaism and the best interests of world Jewry and the American Jewish community. And given the atmosphere of these times, I feel it's my responsibility to state that as clearly as I can, as passionately as I can. If you don't like the message, there's a shul next door that you might want to entertain. But what I've found is many more people resonate to this message and feel grateful that there's somebody who's standing up and saying this in clear language and passionately. And that's what I think all of us need to do. And to the extent that if I do that, it gives some encouragement to other people to do that, which I've also seen, even better.
I'm curious, were you doing this pre-October 7th?
I was doing it pre-October 7th, not with the intensity of post-October 7th. As I say, everything changed post-October 7th. But I was already becoming concerned about the growing distancing between American Jews and Israel, especially in the younger generations, and what was happening on campus way before October 7th, and began to speak about it already by 2017 or 2018. But I gave some really passionate sermons. I can send them to you if you're interested. But as I say, the stakes became much, much higher on October 7th.
And as we wind down our conversation, so I just have two more curiosities. One is in terms of, I noticed your career trajectory, at least from what I've observed, like in people I interact with. So what often happens is people leave the pulpit, they maybe move on to like a Jewish communal, a larger role, but many of those people don't then go back to a pulpit. At least that's what I've observed in my milieu. And it seems that you've done exactly that, right? You were in the pulpit, you went to more broader communal endeavor, and then back to the pulpit. So I'm curious how that evolved, or what was your thinking in that regard?
So I was at one of these rabbinical conferences when I was very young. I came out of school, I was 29 years old, and I had served for 2 years as an assistant rabbi in a big congregation here in New York. By the way, the senior rabbi, Harvey Tattlebaum, is still a very close friend of mine. I see him from time to time. He's over 90 years old now. So I happened to be at a CCR convention, and Artza had a search committee. My predecessor ended up being the president of the URJ, Eric Yaffe, who was the director of Artza at the time, and announced that he was leaving and he was being promoted. And the job was open, and they stopped me. Members of the search committee stopped me at the CCR and said, "Is this something you'd be interested in?" At the time, I was a rabbi for 2 years. It was unheard of that somebody so young would get this position. It was a big national position, and I couldn't say no to it. So I took it, not necessarily thinking that I would spend the rest of my career there. And so I was eager to get back into the congregational world. I had never been a senior rabbi. And so 12 years later.
More a function of, right, just the timing for you than it was, right? The people I know, they go to the national level when they're 50 or 45. It's a different ballgame. They're less likely to go back to a pulpit after the 15 years in that national role, they're closer to retirement. You, in fact, were kind of plucked at a very early age, maybe ahead of your time. So it made sense. It makes more
Yeah.
sense.
But I'll add something else, another dimension. I think I sensed it at the time, and I certainly sense this now, that the real influence now in the American Jewish community is on the local level. The national institutions are experiencing what other national institutions in American life and in Western civilization are experiencing. Growing polarization. It's getting harder and harder to run national organizations. The energy and the potential influence that you have and the freedom to say what you want to say and to do what you want to do is much greater on a local level. And if you can create that, it has national resonance. And that's what I found here for the last 20 years at Stephen Wise.
As just an extension of that, just in terms of the social media tools, what's your thinking in terms of how you I had when I was a congregational rabbi, back in my day. So I always thought about that dynamic, particularly in Manhattan, where it was very transient. And I found that week in, week out, you'd almost have different people in the pews. You weren't necessarily going to have that same consistency week after week. I was always thinking about using other platforms to connect with my congregants and others. How do you kind of conceptualize your cult, your virtual synagogue, or your means to influence beyond the people you're talking to in front of you?
Yeah. So for all of us outside the halachic world, COVID imposed on us the need to become social media experts. Okay, because the Orthodox synagogues closed too during COVID, but they rushed back as soon as they could for obvious reasons. They couldn't use electricity on Shabbat, so it had to be in person. Even that was spotty, at the beginning, and it took quite a while to get back. But for us, for the rest of us, we needed to figure out how to continue to reach people. And we became social media experts very quickly. It's really quite impressive. So COVID kind of sealed the deal for everybody, and it accelerated what would have happened anyway, which is a move into much more social media. I would just tell you, for me, I believe that it's important. If you want to be influential, you have to be where the people are. And it doesn't necessarily connote that you approve of, the other people who are reading what you're writing or reacting to what you're writing or own the social media platforms, right? But you have to be where the people are. Now, that said, I'm of the generation, that didn't grow up with this stuff. So I realize the necessity of being there. I appreciate that I'm never going to be an expert on actually doing it, nor do I want to spend the time to acquire that expertise. Imagine, if I did nothing for 6 months but study social media, I could get up to an acceptable level. But I don't want to spend that time, and I don't want to spend the time that would be necessary to continue to cultivate that social media presence. But it is fundamental to our work. So what I do is I hire a lot of really great, brilliant young people, and they do it for me.
No, I hear you. I hear you. No. So, final question. I always like to ask public personalities this question. What's something about you that most people don't know? Like, what's something that people would find, I guess, surprising? People that follow you for a long time, people that listen to your sermons, maybe your congregants, something that you'd be willing to share that maybe most people don't know about you.
That's a great question. First of all, I'll just tell you, in the rabbinate, I try not to share too much personal because, it is delicate if you're a public figure as well. But I'll tell you this, we had, for years and years, I assumed I was an extroverted personality. And we have a staff meeting every year. We take 2 days off. We leave the synagogue and we spend time together. And we do various educational programs and brainstorm and program for next year. So one year, our staff was very interested to get an expert on these personality tests,
Interesting.
And I said, yeah, sure. If that's what you want to do, that's what you want to do. And of course, I had to participate as well. And I'm answering all these questions and answering all these questions. And the person who was moderating this and had expertise, she tells me, you're an introvert. And it stunned me because I had never thought that I was introverted. And I had seen other colleagues who were introverted, and they could do a good job in what I always assumed was an extroverted occupation, being a rabbi, right? So that really, really surprised me. And it led to a greater self-appreciation and self-knowledge for me moving forward. And I think I'm more patient with myself than I used to be.
Does that mean, for example, like I don't know if you have like the context of a kiddush, but any type of like gathering, communal gathering, you find yourself like drained after all that interaction? I always
Yes. So that's the really interesting thing. That's what she told me. It's not, I enjoy, when I'm with people.
You're not like my wife and I
Right.
are opposites in this regard, and like I'll come out like kind of I can as I get older I get drained from it too. That's the truth. But at my younger age, I used to like I'd come out like like after our gala, right? I'd come out like I'm like I can't go to sleep. I'm so charged, as opposed to like being like, oh my goodness, I'm so glad it's over with type of thing. Not personally, but just like okay, I'm spent type of thing, right?
That is exactly what she told me, and that was clarifying.
Things. You're not as hard as on yourself because you appreciate that that's your nature. Like, why am I not? I should be more like, right. So that.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, Rabbi, thank you so much. This was a great leading conversation. I want to commend you for being selected to the J100 list of the Allgemeiner in 2024 for your incredible support, outspokenness for Israel, for the Jewish people, your Zionism, and your voice. I appreciate our friendship, and I appreciate all the insight that you shared that I'm sure our audience is going to embrace and learn a lot from. So thank you so much for making the time. I know you're incredibly busy, so we really...
Thank you very much, David, and regards to all the Allgemeiner friends, and good luck. Congratulations on your new position, and I'm sure you'll do it terrific.